Good. Now I'm being joined here today by Katy Hayward, who is Senior Fellow Europe in UK in a Changing Europe, and also of Queen's University Belfast. And we're going to be talking about a subject that's been coming up a lot in many different features since the referendum of 2016. What Brexit means from the point of view of Northern Ireland, and what Northern Ireland means for Brexit, and now we're in the era where Brexit has actually happened, what it means for our relationship with the EU and the internal position of the UK itself going forward. Now, for me, there's a very interesting constitutional dimension to all of this, Katie. So that's what I want to get onto. But because I thought the paper you wrote for UK and Changing Europe was very interesting on the white paper the government itself published on this subject of the Northern Ireland aspects of the agreement in May, and I thought it was very helpful. So I thought it'd be useful to talk through some of the key implications of that agreement and the way the UK and the EU respectively are approaching them, and then we'll get on to what this might mean specifically for the Constitution. So that's the kind of background. So the first thing I'd like to ask, Katie, is as I understand it, that the Northern Ireland aspects of the withdrawal agreement, and they are, that's the basis on which the UK left the EU in January, this withdrawal agreement, are supposed to come into force irrespective of whether the EU and the UK secure any other kind of deal by the end of the transition period. Is that correct? And if so, do you think the UK government is fully bought into this point, that this is supposed to come into force whatever? And might the UK government contemplate weaponising non-compliance as a means of forcing concessions from the EU?
So to answer the first part of that question first, yes, the protocol is part of the withdrawal agreement. So that's already not only been agreed and signed off, but of course it's been ratified by the UK Parliament with a very clear majority, and also of course by the EU. So that's all in place. And the protocol is a legally binding part of the withdrawal agreement. And on top of that, of course, we have the governance arrangements that oversee the withdrawal agreement, and they're overseeing the protocol too. And so basically, when we were coming into this transition period, there are two aspects of UK-EU talks that are of interest to Northern Ireland in particular. So we've got the UK-EU future relationship talks, but then we also have the talks about implementing the withdrawal agreement, implementing the protocol in particular. And this is a really interesting test case for the EU in some ways, to look at the UK and say, how seriously are you taking this, right? Because this is legally binding. We negotiated it after sort of, an agonizing period. We did revise the protocol. We got rid of the backstop. You ratified this, you signed up to this. Now it's just a matter of implementing it. And the fact that there is a very fundamental disagreement, I think, or maybe mismatch, then maybe that's a better way of putting it, mismatch in approach between the UK and the EU about the protocol itself, is setting alarm bells ringing somewhat. So the command paper that you referred to there, that was published on 20th of May, was very reassuring for the EU. And also, I should say, for many people in Northern Ireland, because it was basically the UK saying, yeah, we recognise you've signed up to this, and this is what it means. And the UK made some really strong statements in that. It was saying, yeah, we will need customs controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's mentioned almost as a sort of an aside, I think it was just one line, but basically saying that EU laws will continue to apply in Northern Ireland, which we may discuss later. It recognised that state aid rules for the EU apply in Northern Ireland. It recognised that VAT rules from the EU apply in Northern Ireland in relation to goods. So it mentions these big whoppers of facts, basically, about what the protocol means. And the EU was like, great, that's good. At least we have this. At least you're acknowledging that. But we still have that question of, well, what does that mean in practice? Yeah. And I think even now, I mean, last week, for example, a couple of MPs from Northern Ireland, DUP MPs in the House of Commons were saying, you know, could there be some waiver for customs controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to the Prime Minister? And the answer was very much fudged. So we still have this sense of ambiguity about whether the UK means what the EU would like or thinks it means when it comes to implementing the protocol. And this gets onto the last point of your question, which is about non-compliance. And my sense of it has been for some time is that we could have a risk. There is a very severe risk of non-compliance, not through any necessarily kind of cunning or you know, a wily way on the UK's part to deliberately undermine the single market, if you like, of the EU, but it could simply be non-compliance through not unpreparedness, not being ready. I won't go so far as to say incompetence, but there is that risk that basically we will get to the point of having to implement the protocol come the 1st of January, come what may, regardless of whether there's a future UK-EU deal, we have to implement the protocol, and we won't be ready to do so. So that's where we come into the question of, well, what non-compliance means and what the EU might possibly do about it.
Okay, that's really clear, and that really leads on to the next question I was going to ask. That this agreement does mean some kind of customs barrier being introduced within the UK, does it? And which also means physical checks and administrative requirements if you're moving goods from one part of the UK into another part of the UK, i.e. from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And we've seen that Boris Johnson previously vacillated on whether that's actually what it meant, and at certain points appeared to say that wasn't what it meant. But the white paper which we're talking about, or the command paper which we're talking about, as you said, appeared to sign up to actually, yes, admitting that the agreement does mean what the agreement says it means, and we accept that, which you might not think is a spectacular breakthrough, but from the context of what had been said previously, was significant. And you've got on, I suppose you really dealt with this, but I mean, in your view, will the UK actually be ready to properly implement these requirements? Because it does require some kind of changes to infrastructure. I know that the UK is saying there'll be no new infrastructure. We're just going to build up the existing that's partly semantics, you know, what constitutes new infrastructure, what constitutes enhanced existing infrastructure. But do you think that the UK is actually going to be ready to do this? And also, will they be doing it to a level that satisfies the EU? I mean, what's your sense on that?
So essentially, I mean, it's a slightly crude way of understanding it, but essentially there's a truth that the UK-EU relationship will be very similar to the GB-NI one when it comes to customs and movement of goods. And we know very clearly, well, basically all the evidence points to the fact that, or suggests that the UK will be not ready to manage the change in customs, or particularly if there's a no deal between UK and the EU come the 1st of January. So we don't have for example, I mean, the basic software, the system that we use for submitting customs declarations, that is not, this has been under an overhaul for the past few years, and it's still not ready for that. And you know, there's an increasing number of reports coming out basically saying that the UK won't be ready, the systems won't be in place to manage that new relationship. And this is in part why the UK has said it will have an adaptation period from the 1st of January for imports. So it can't decide what the EU is going to do for goods going from the UK into the EU or GB into the EU, but it can control somewhat what it allows in from the EU side, and basically it'll be quite lax in that regard for 6 months. And there's a staging, you know, basically just trying to make it manageable. Now, it's different for GB-NI because it will be the same as GB into the EU. So basically that means it's in effect, it's up to the EU. And the EU has been very clear, this is in force on the 1st of January. There's no adaptation period, nothing like that. You don't have the right to sort of say that. And so everything needs to be ready to go. And anybody, and I've done a lot of work on borders and management of borders, and especially looking particularly at where electronic systems are used to try and speed up and make more effective the movement across borders. And everybody says, you need time. Especially if you're bringing in a new system, new forms of administrative procedures are required. New levels of detail, new amounts of data are required, plus a process for putting all of that in. That takes time for people to get used to, and let alone to know exactly what they have to submit. So we're unclear on all of these key matters, and there is a situation at the moment where there's sort of the UK government is emphasising that it's consulting with business in Northern Ireland, but from what I understand, and it is very much at the kind of testing ideas. Now we are like months away, and especially if it's going to be involving IT systems, which it will. There's really very little for us to have confidence that the systems will be there. And as you mentioned, physical infrastructure. I mean, even this week, Warren Point Harbour, which is quite a significant port for Northern Ireland. They were, the chief of the port there was basically saying we don't know. We know according to the EU rules what should be in place, but we don't yet have that sort of the green light to go and build that, and it will require building. So physically, we're not going to be ready either. So things are not looking things are not looking good. And the question is, I think a lot of it is to do with, the UK likes the brinkmanship thing in Brexit. We've seen that all the time. The ticking clock that Barnier mentions a lot. The UK doesn't seem to mind that much, but there's a real. I mean, now it's real, and businesses are worrying about that. And I think the big issue is this isn't just Northern Ireland's concern. We're relying on businesses in Britain being prepared for the new arrangements coming into Northern Ireland. And the risk is if they don't know what they have to do, or if they think it's too much hassle, they simply won't bother. And then it becomes an issue for consumers here, of course, increasing prices, decreasing choice. And that's when it becomes increasingly political as well, if you like.
Yes, and we'll come back to some of that and what might happen if we don't comply or unable to comply or whatever it is in the UK. The command paper we've been talking about, some of the language of it seemed to try and create the impression that this agreement is a kind of fleeting thing that will be around for a while, but might not be around for much longer. Now, because Northern Ireland has been given certain rights regarding whether or not they can pull out of some of it. But my understanding is that it will be enforced in full for a minimum of 6 years, and elements of it can't be pulled out of at all. And then also that the Assembly has a vote after 4 years, and therefore has the option at that point of pulling out of some of it, subject to a 2-year delay. But even then, for a vote like that to actually go through that they wanted to pull out would require more than one party to actually vote for that to happen. So, I mean, given that the UK government's position in the command paper seemed to be predicated on this might not be around for long anyway, how realistic is it that even at the shortest possible time period of 6 years, there's actually going to have been that vote after 4 years? How likely is that? I mean, obviously, it's difficult to predict exactly how things are going to work out politically, but what do the politics look like on that, really, to you?
So this sounds very cynical, but I don't think they would have put in that clause for democratic consent if they thought there was a serious risk of Northern Ireland voting to disapply. Basically, as you say, it relates to just Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol, which are with those articles relating to goods, essentially, in trade. Intellectually, it's quite fascinating because they've brought the question of consent, and that this issue really arose in response to the backstop that Theresa May brought forward originally, and especially from January 2019, unionist concerns about the backstop tied in with the Brexiteers' concerns about the backstop. There's a lot of emphasis upon, Northern Ireland will have distinctive arrangements applied here. You need the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. So that really came into play, and as a result, a big addition, or significant addition to the protocol, was this democratic consent vote by MLAs. But yeah, I mean, I did note, I think it was very significant in the command paper that the UK government was giving the impression, although it didn't go quite so far as to be, to state a whole untruth, but the impression was that, it said, for example, as long as the protocol is in force. And as we said at the beginning of this conversation, the protocol is there, that's it. It's been ratified, it's legally binding, it's an international agreement, etc., etc. And it's only Articles 5 to 10 that the MLAs will be voting on. And I mean, it is extraordinary if you think about it, because essentially you're talking about 90 members of a regional legislative assembly who will be voting on the possibility of basically that whole issue of the Irish border question coming back into play. So the future of the single market of the European Union could rest on the vote of just, a few MLAs. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to predict what things are going to look like by the time we come to November, December 2024. And my worry, and this is partly why I'm quite critical of working parts of the command paper, critical of the other parts of the command paper, especially that idea that the protocol can be could be dumped.
Yeah.
Because I think there is a real risk of emphasizing the threats to the union per se, which is a much more complicated matter than needs to be handled very carefully. And the impression was, people could have taken from the command paper the idea that, well, if unionists object to it strongly enough, then you can vote it down, and we can, can align instead with the UK. And of course, that's far too simplistic an understanding or a presentation of this very complicated arrangement, which was a compromise. Nobody's really saying that clearly enough. The EU is compromised, Northern Ireland has free access into the single market. UK is compromised too. That's why it was such an achievement to get, but that's why our handling of it now, politically as well as legally, and then practically, as you were saying, really needs to be done with, performed with great care.
Good, and perhaps the Walloon Parliament that we often hear about as holding a kind of a veto over things could be replicated in a different way in the case of the Northern Ireland Assembly. We'll see. Mm-hmm. Now this leads on to what for me is the central constitutional point to all of this, is that the implications of all of this, assuming it comes into force, which it's required to, is that part of the UK, i.e. Northern Ireland, will be subject to different legal rules and subject to different customs arrangements to the rest of the UK. And that's constitutionally very interesting. But on top of that, those rules and those custom regulations and interpretation of those rules will be carried out, will be implemented by an entity, that is the EU and its various organs, that's external to the UK, and into which, following Brexit, the UK will no longer have any direct input. I mean, is that a fair interpretation? And for me, if it is, then that's quite an extraordinary constitutional position to have got ourselves into.
It is a fair interpretation up to a point. So I would stress that the withdrawal agreement and the protocol within it is overseen by the Joint Committee. That's Michael Gove and Maris Sefcovic. So they are overseeing that. And then we have the specialised committee. Again, you have UK, EU membership of that specialised committee overseeing the protocol. So the starting point, yes, is that EU rules, and there's something like 280 pages. So fascinating, in the protocol, you've got two pages of preamble, 13 pages of the actual articles, and then something like 48 pages of annexes, where you list all the EU, directives, for example, that apply. So it's pretty big. And I mean, these rules apply at the moment anyway, and most of them, have been translated over into UK law. The question will be what happened? Sorry.
Time being, until we might just start changing them in theory. Yeah.
Precisely. So then the question is, this is where this is where you begin to get into the knotty questions of the UK internal market as well. So Northern Ireland will have to continue to be aligning to EU standards and rules directly. What will the rest of the UK do? And it was very interesting for somebody who like obsesses around discourse and things. It was interesting to see, having seen Theresa May emphasize the UK internal market, so the integrity of the UK internal market and those kind of phrases, the integrity of the United Kingdom, as distinct from the integrity of the EU single market, which Barnier and others emphasized. Now the language in the command paper was on about the UK customs territory, and they're sort of dropping that UK internal market stuff. And that's kind of interesting, because who has ever thought of the UK customs territory before? It's not really a concept that unionists have been proud to defend. But that's what we have now, because that's what's there in the protocol. Northern Ireland is an integral part of the UK's customs territory. Well, thanks very much, but we're an integral part of it, but we're applying EU customs rule. We're applying the Union Customs Code. So there's a strange kind of there's a little bit of sense of almost gaslighting a wee bit, that the rules of the EU are being applied for goods here in Northern Ireland, and then the consequences of that, they could easily be politicized if people wanted it to. I mean, and I think there's a real danger in that, because it's so easy to think of the blame game here in Northern Ireland. So a point I make a lot is that amongst the Northern Ireland population, you've essentially got those people who never wanted Brexit in the first place, and they object to the protocol because they didn't want any of that to be in place at all. And then you have people who object to the protocol. They may be pro-leave, but they object to the protocol because of that distinct position that it puts Northern Ireland in, which can be interpreted as being a threat to the union or not. We'll talk about that in a minute. But so nobody here really wants it. So the question is, how do we? This is where we are. This is our future for the time being. So how do we manage it in the least destabilizing way possible? If you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I mean, and it strikes me that the underlying issue here is that there's no version of Brexit that isn't disruptive for Northern Ireland, apart from perhaps a Brexit in name only, which doesn't change anything. But then even that could create some disruptions. But that particular variety of Brexit is the version that's least acceptable to those who advocated Brexit, because why else did they want Brexit? So that, I guess, it's easy to criticise these arrangements, but these arrangements are the product of an underlying decision to leave the EU, and certain things. There's no way of responding to that doesn't create problems for at least some people, and perhaps different groups at the same time. And that kind of leads on to the question of what are the implications of this agreement for the future place of Northern Ireland within the UK, in your opinion? Big question, I know, but it needs to be asked.
So when the consent issue came up in last year, and people began to talk about consent, and I wrote a piece with a colleague, David Finnemore, sort of in response to this, and began to write more on it, which is basically to say the question of consent as it's related to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is, and it's been there really as a principle in British-Irish relations vis-a-vis Northern Ireland for many decades now, as basically majority consent, so no change to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland unless you have the consent of the majority of people in Northern Ireland, right? Now that question of consent was kind of distorted. Well, in my view, it was distorted somewhat about this when it came to Brexit, and how to manage Northern Ireland's distinct and unique needs and interests. I would I think certainly, I mean, longer term, there will be challenges, very real challenges for Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market. And this isn't something distinct to Northern Ireland. I think the UK internal market um, will be under pressure and will increasingly, there's a risk of increasing fragmentation between the constituent parts of the UK, because it was the EU single market that allowed devolution to work, and for the, we're basically all in the same basket with our various means of interpreting EU directives, etc. So the UK internal market will be under pressure. That need not necessarily mean that the union itself is under pressure. And this is where it gets really complicated, right? So talking with others in Scotland and Wales. So from Northern Ireland's point of view, if you like, from our interests, GB, of course, is its most significant, I mean, call it trade department, but where we have most of our sales, etc. Then, for Northern Ireland's interest, that having some kind of close alignment between the UK and the EU makes a lot of sense. So we need, if you like, a close UK-EU relationship as close as possible, because that minimizes the hardness of the Irish Sea border. Okay. And we want, so it would make logical sense to have legislative frameworks that ensure that the whole of the UK is kind of working along the same lines, and for Northern Ireland's interest, that would be similar lines to the EU standards. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas from the point of view from Scotland, they're very cautious. They're a bit wary of that, because they don't want to be tied in terms of in a legal framework into what the UK Westminster Parliament might decide to do.
Yeah.
So we have these really interesting dynamics going on, and you can't separate them from politics. And even though, it just depends the lens you put on them. But fundamentally, I think it's really important to stress that nothing has changed the constitutional position of Northern Ireland in the Union, because that will not change unless we have the majority consent of Northern Ireland through a referendum.
Yeah, so that's still the bar that has to be reached in whatever the politics and the dynamics may be. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that in some ways it may be that European Union membership was the glue holding the United Kingdom together. And I guess the fact that devolution, obviously there was devolution in Northern Ireland before, but it was suspended actually the year before we joined the European Communities in 1972. We joined in 1973. But it's interesting that we devolution as we have it now is all implemented while we're members of the EU. So we don't know what it's really like to run an asymmetrical devolved union outside of the EU. We're going to find out. So it may be that actually that was what was, to some extent, doesn't mean the UK's doomed to fall apart, but it's interesting that might have been something that was helping hold it together. And the fact that we are suddenly talking about almost looking at trade between different parts. No one would have ever thought, is England an export market for Scotland, for instance? And it was never thought about in those terms, how much trade Northern Ireland has with Great Britain. It didn't really arise. It was just internal. There may have been figures somewhere, but the idea that you're almost looking upon different parts of the same country as exporting and importing with each other. And again, this is something which Brexit is forcing us to think about, which is quite an interesting phenomenon. What it all means is anybody's guess, and it leads on really to another difficult question for you, because you're doing very well with these. Do you think that the agreement is going to prove workable? And then what happens if in some way it does fail?
I think so. There's, in some ways, you could say there's no reason why it shouldn't be workable. So we do. I mean, and the big concern that everybody had with regards to sort of risk of no deal in process of withdrawal was the legal chaos and confusion. We don't have that. So even if there is a no deal at the end of these current negotiations, which obviously we all hope doesn't happen, because it really will put pressure on the union and other things from the union's point of view. but at least we have that legal framework existing. So it is workable. We know the laws and Northern Ireland has to follow, etc., etc. I think there's a bigger question, and again, my colleague David Finnemore and I have written a bit on this and are working on it, is this question of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Which, for obvious reasons, isn't a word that we've really appended very much to Brexit and the outcome of Brexit and the protocol, but it is a big question, I think, because if the protocol is seen as illegitimate in some ways, now either through either because, as you noted earlier, the Northern Ireland doesn't have direct, it doesn't have any decision shaping powers over the protocol or what it means, it doesn't have, it's just an observer status, if you like, on the specialised committee and the joint committee. Despite the fact, obviously, those committees are basically deciding its future in many ways. So that the question, if it's seen as illegitimate, the protocol, or indeed if the consequences of the protocol seem to be so negative as that it puts Northern Ireland under extreme strain, then we do have a problem. And I think the UK government emphasises this a lot to the EU. It's always saying, like the command paper, sort of emphasising the fact we have a fragile environment here, peace process, etc., etc. We need to make sure this all impacts as little as possible on the everyday lives of people in Northern Ireland. And the EU is aware of that too. And so we have this real, tension between trying to make sure that, that the protocol is effectively operating at the same time as avoiding negative consequences. And this is where we come back to the fact of, that those UK-EU talks really are, really do affect Northern Ireland in a distinct way, because it's not just, the UK-EU, it really will affect Northern Ireland's relationship with the rest of the UK. So, and I really would point to a tension between, for example, Michael Gove emphasizing, light touch, light touch application of the protocol, and, the protocol, have to not impact too harshly on Northern Ireland, blah, 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 and at the same time say, be quite blasé about a no deal UK-EU.
Yeah.
Because there's this complete contradiction. So this is where, this is why, why many of us would be concerned about the protocol, that it has to be handled very carefully. So I think there's no reason why it can be workable, but we really need to invest now in making sure that that Northern Ireland isn't that crunch point again. It's not the point at which the EU is forced to say to the UK, listen, guys, you're not taking this seriously at all. You're not a trustworthy trading partner or person to, not a trustworthy partner to do any deal with. And where the UK isn't waving the instability and fragility of Northern Ireland back in the face of the EU or the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and saying, you're playing fast and loose with a peace process. It's a really dangerous situation, and I think the more calm heads there are and the more sort of openness there is about the significance of the protocol, then that creates an environment in which it's not depoliticized, that we don't have this idea that the union's under threat, but more to the point about what could be done to secure Northern Ireland's position economically, first and foremost, and across the whole of the UK. I mean, we're all in a really we're all in a very difficult situation, going into a huge period of economic uncertainty, and so the more calm the rhetoric, the happier we would all feel about the prospects of coming out of this relatively unscathed.
Thank you. And I suppose in the end, one thing that will play into all of this is how serious the UK government really is about not being worried about not getting a deal. Because that, I think, but we will see what happens. Katy, thank you very much indeed. That's been great. I recommend reading Katie's excellent paper on this. Is it on the UK in a Changing Europe website? Will they?
Changing Europe, yes, it's hidden in the back somewhere, but it's there.
Oh,
Thanks, Anne.
excellent. Thank you.